The Union Army of the Potomac, under the command of Major General Joseph Hooker, was recovering from the disastrous defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg in December 1862. Hooker, known for his aggressiveness and reformist approach, was tasked with revitalizing a demoralized army. He successfully reorganized the army, improved soldier morale, and planned an ambitious campaign to outflank Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Hooker's plan involved a multi-pronged approach. He intended to send a significant portion of his force to cross the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, west of Fredericksburg, aiming to cut off Lee's supply lines and force him into an open battle. Concurrently, a smaller force under General John Sedgwick was to engage Lee's forces at Fredericksburg, preventing them from reinforcing their main body. On the Confederate side, General Robert E. Lee faced significant challenges. His army, although victorious at Fredericksburg, was outnumbered, undersupplied, and facing a Union force invigorated by new leadership. However, Lee's audacity and tactical ingenuity were his greatest assets. In the face of Hooker's offensive, Lee planned to use the dense wilderness of the region, known as the Wilderness of Spotsylvania, to neutralize the numerical superiority of the Union forces. By the time of the battle, the Army of the Potomac, commanded by General Joseph Hooker, had 133,868 men and 413 guns. General Robert Lee's Army of Northern Virginia fielded 60,298 men and 220 guns. On April 27th, the initial three corps of the Army of the Potomac began their march under the leadership of Slocum. They began to concentrate on April 30th around the hamlet of Chancellorsville, which was little more than a single large, brick mansion at the junction of the Orange Turnpike and Orange Plank Road. Hooker arrived late in the afternoon on April 30th and made the mansion his headquarters. Pleased with the success of the operation so far, and realizing that the Confederates were not vigorously opposing the river crossings, Hooker ordered Sickles to begin the movement of the Third Corps from Falmouth the night of April 30th. By May 1st, Hooker had approximately 70,000 men concentrated in and around Chancellorsville. The Federals had encountered virtually no opposition to this point. Hooker, however, decided to halt at Chancellorsville and await the arrival of additional Union troops. This fateful decision disheartened the Federal officers on the scene, who recognized the urgency of maintaining the momentum they had thus far sustained. Confederate Commander Stonewall Jackson left the Fredericksburg lines in the early morning of May 1st. He arrived at Zoen Church 5 hours later. There he found two divisions of Confederate infantry under the command of Major General Richard H. Anderson and Major General Lafayette McLaws, who were fortifying a prominent ridge covering the Turnpike and Plank Road. Although his corps had not yet appeared, Jackson ordered Anderson and McLaws to drop their shovels, pick up their rifles, and advance to the attack. Jackson's audacity was a key factor that dictated the shape of the Battle of Chancellorsville. Hooker finally authorized an eastward movement late in the morning of May 1st. These troops on the Turnpike and Plank Road engaged with the Confederates. Union frontline commanders had not expected this kind of resistance. They sent anxious messages to Hooker, who quickly ordered his generals to fall back to the wilderness and assume a defensive posture. Late in the day, the Union built entrenchments encircling Hooker's Chancellorsville headquarters, and Major General Darius Couch approached his superior. As the Army's senior corps commander, Couch had advocated an offensive strategy and shared his comrades' opinions, which were similar to his. "It is all right, Couch," Hooker reassured him. "I have got Lee just where I want him. He must fight me on my own ground." Confederate scouts verified the Federals' strong positions extending from the Rappahannock River around Chancellorsville to the high, open ground at Hazel Grove. The Southern Army could not afford a costly frontal attack against prepared fortifications. Later that night, Lee's cavalry chief, Jeb Stuart, brought decisive intelligence. The Union right flank was completely exposed. From that moment on, the generals thought of nothing but how to gain access to Hooker's vulnerable flank. Before dawn, Lee and Jackson studied a hastily drawn map and decided to undertake one of the biggest gambles in American military history. Jackson's corps, about 30,000 troops, would follow a series of country roads and woods paths to reach the exposed Union right. Lee, with the remaining 14,000 infantry, would occupy a position more than 3 miles long and divert Hooker's attention during Jackson's flanking move. Once in position, Jackson would smash the Federals with his full strength while Lee would hold his position. The Army of Northern Virginia would thus be fractured into 3 pieces, counting Early's contingent at Fredericksburg, any one of which might be subject to rout or annihilation if the Union resumed the offensive. Jackson led his column past the bivouac early on the morning of May 2nd. He conferred briefly with Lee, then trotted down the furnace road with the fire of battle kindled in his eyes. The Federals notified Hooker of the enemy movement. Hooker correctly identified Jackson's maneuver as an effort to reach his right flank. He advised the area commander, Major General Oliver Howard, to be on the lookout for an attack from the west. As the morning progressed, however, the Union chief grew to believe that Lee was actually withdrawing instead of attempting to flank them, and worries about his right disappeared. Instead, he ordered his Third Corps to harass the tail end of Lee's retreating army. Major General Daniel Sickles commanded the Third Corps. In mid-afternoon, the Union attacked Jackson's rearguard in an area along an unfinished railroad. The Union successfully overwhelmed these Confederate troops, capturing nearly an entire Georgia regiment. This engagement had attracted a large number of Union troops from elsewhere, thus effectively isolating Howard's 11th Corps on the right with no nearby support. Meanwhile, the bulk of Jackson's column marched along uncharted trails. Jackson continued to make Hooker think that the Confederates were retreating by turning away from the Union line on 2 occasions. The exhausting march, which altogether traversed more than 12 miles, ended about 3 p.m. when Jackson's troops began deploying into battle lines astride the Turnpike. The awe-inspiring Confederate front measured nearly 2 miles across. Although individual Northern officers and men warned of Jackson's approach, the Union 11th Corps headquarters dismissed the reports as frightened exaggerations. Hooker's shortage of cavalry hampered the Federals' ability to penetrate the wilderness and uncover the Confederate presence with certainty. Only 2 small regiments and half a New York battery faced west in the direction of Jackson's corps. Jackson's corps erupted from the trees and charged at the Union troops. Along the road it was pandemonium, recalled a Massachusetts soldier, and on the side of the road it was chaos. Most of Howard's men fought bravely, drawing 3 additional battle lines across Jackson's path. But the overmatched Union troops occupied an untenable position. The screaming Gray Legions overwhelmed each Union stand and eventually drove the 11th Corps completely from the field. The increasing disorganization of Jackson's men forced Jackson to call a reluctant halt to the advance about 7:50. He summoned Major General A.P. Hill's division to the front, determined to renew his attack despite the darkness. While Hill brought his brigades forward, Jackson rode ahead of his men to scout out the position. When he attempted to return, a North Carolina regiment mistook his small party for Union cavalry. Jackson was shot and wounded, and he succumbed to his injuries 8 days later. Despite his misfortune on May 2nd, Hooker still held the advantage at Chancellorsville. He was still able to take out each part of the Confederate army if he went on the aggressive. He received reinforcements during the night, and the 3rd Corps moved back from Catharine Furnace to reoccupy Hazel Grove. The Confederate commanders understood the need to connect their divisions, and Stuart prepared an all-out assault against Hazel Grove at dawn. As the Southerners approached the far crest of Hazel Grove, they witnessed Sickles' men retiring in an orderly fashion. Hooker had directed that his troops surrender the key ground and fall back to Fairview. The Confederates immediately exploited the opportunity by placing 31 cannons on Hazel Grove. Combined with artillery located west along the Turnpike, the gunners at Hazel Grove pounded Fairview with a spectacular bombardment. The Federals responded with 34 pieces of their own. The bloodiest fighting of the battle occurred between 6:30 and 9:30 a.m. on May 3rd. The Confederates launched brigade after brigade against entrenched Union lines on both sides of the Turnpike. The back and forth fighting began to favor the Southerners as, one by one, Union artillery pieces dropped out of the contest. Hooker failed to resupply his cannoneers with ammunition or shift sufficient infantry reserves to critical areas. A Confederate projectile hit a pillar at Chancellorsville, throwing the Union commander violently to the ground. The impact stunned Hooker, physically removing him from a battle. The Confederates pressed forward first to Fairview and then against the remaining Union units at Chancellorsville. Lee's wing advanced simultaneously from the south and east. Lee was cheered on by his men who recognized him as the architect of their improbable victory. The Southern commander wasted little time on reflection. He prepared to pursue Hooker and seal the success achieved since dawn. However, a courier bearing news from Fredericksburg shattered Lee's plans. The Union had pressed forward at Fredericksburg and now threatened the Confederate rear. This changed everything. Lee assigned Stuart to watch Hooker's host and sent McLaws eastward to deal with the Union menace. The Confederates, who retreated from Fredericksburg, met up with the Confederates under the command of McLaw 4 miles west of town at Salem Church. The Union attacked this Confederate position. However, a Confederate counterattack drove them back, ending the day's combat. The next day, Lee shoved the Union back across the Rappahannock at Banks Ford and once again focused on the main Union army in the wilderness. Hooker, however, had seen enough. Despite the objections of most of his corps commanders, he ordered a withdrawal across the river. The Union troops conducted their retreat under cover of darkness and arrived back in Stafford County on May 6. The Union had been defeated but not decisively enough to end the war. Some 40,000 Federals had done no fighting whatsoever. The Union suffered more than 17,000 casualties, and the Confederates suffered 13,000 casualties. Lee's triumph at Chancellorsville imbued him with the belief that his army was invincible. He convinced the Richmond government to endorse his proposed offensive into Pennsylvania. Within 6 weeks, the Army of Northern Virginia confidently embarked on a journey northward to a place called Gettysburg.